Welcome back to the Aviation RC Noob Podcast. You found us. My name is Joe.
And I'm Matt.
We're here to be with you along your journey and to share our experiences in RC aviation. If you have any questions, thoughts, or want to share a flight story, hit us up at aviationrcnoob@gmail.com. Now, buckle in. Let's take off.
Welcome back. It's episode 22. Joe and I are going to talk about trainers. It's an RC. We're talking about the RC planes as well as a full-size craft, because really any pilot, whenever they start, they need to get involved with a plane that'll help them learn and keeps them excited. And full-size craft makes sure that they return to the ground safely. So before we do that, as we always do, let's talk about our fly stories and things that we've been doing in the last couple of weeks. I think I'm going to start, Joe, and unless you'd like to start with your stories.
No, by all means. I think I normally start, so go for it.
All right, sounds good. Okay, so really I've really only gone out maybe 2 times, and it's a crime because it has been downright beautiful. Both
really
weather, both like temperature, as well as wind and things like that. So I ended up basically going out with 2 days. I took the Duster out one night and just goofed around. Ended up meeting a guy who lives 3 miles away from the field, and he just wanted to kind of see what was going on. I brought a couple of my other, I'll call it experimental craft, to try and maiden them, and it turned out, something. I'm trying to remember. As I was checking it over, I realized that they weren't quite airworthy for some reason or another. Either I think I had one where the ESC wasn't booting up properly, and that needed a little bit more inspection. And the other one, I think, and I ultimately brought them back out to the field. So we'll get on to that. But basically, there's something that caused them to not really be able to work. But I was able to get the FPV system going. I was able to record some footage. And I was able to fly FPV from the flight test Duster. That's a low wing kind of trainer style plane. And I was able to just kind of fly around and enjoy a couple touch and goes. It's one of those planes that's really durable, because I've landed a couple times where the grass caught hold of the landing gear pretty tightly. And it either did a cartwheel or something. But as many times as that happened, I was able to kind of taxi around, and it doesn't take much speed for that plane to get off the ground. And that's part of what we'll talk about with trainers, is that with a low wing loading, which is basically high lift for a low weight of the plane, it doesn't take much to get a plane into the air, which is one of the things that's a hallmark of trainer planes. And some people could probably call the Duster a trainer, but it does tend to have a lot more acrobatic tendencies. So as in, it's a lot more responsive than most trainers tend to be. And we'll talk about the differences of that in a little bit. But anyway, Duster is a great plane, had a great time flying around the field, was able to use that as a springboard to talk to this gentleman who turns out he used to live in the same area I used to live in 20 years ago, actually 10 years ago. And we were, he had just recently moved, and he's like, man, I don't live far, but I love coming out here and seeing if anybody's flying, because it's just fun to watch. Because when I was back home, I built a couple of the flight test models, and we started talking about that. And I told him, I said, look, you really ought to just buy some, if you've got the motors. And so he goes, no, I didn't get rid of anything. But when I moved, I got rid of the planes, but I didn't get rid of any of the hardware. I said, well, geez, go build another plane and come on out and join us. It'll be a lot of fun. So, and he said, oh, I might, we just kept talking, and it was just a good conversation. It was one of those meeting somebody who's like-minded. And I'm hoping I get to catch him out of the field one day in the near future.
That'd be nice.
So, yeah. And it was around dusk, and it was good. It was a good flight all around. And then I went out a couple days later, and I brought out the Eachine Reptile, which is an EPP foam wing that I've had, man, I've had it forever. And I don't know I know why. I had a Maytech F 411 flight board stabilizer thing. And installing the board, the directions weren't as terribly clear. And I think I fried something. So I ended up ordering a new board, and I meant to put it in, and it, because it took a month to get, to the house, I had already moved on to like 6 or 7 different projects from that point. So I put the board to the side and the Reptile back on the shelf. And after a while, I'm like, you know what? I don't need the board to fly. I was hoping to use it to get the kids involved.
Right.
So I'm like, just let's pull this out and fly it around and just see how it performs. And I did. And I got out over the end of the grass. And I was trimming it out, and I was pretty close. And I kept hitting the wrong button. So I glanced down to see which trim button I was hitting.
Dangerous maneuver.
It was the fatal maneuver, I guess, because when I looked back up, I'm like, oh, that's going to the ground. And I couldn't recover it in time. And it dumped into pretty tall grass, which I'm like, oh, this is great. It's EPP foam, which is a really resilient material. And it's in tall grass. Wait. It's in tall grass. And I'm sitting there going, oh no, how am I going to find this thing? And what I ended up doing is kind of like making sure I had everything shut down, but I keep forgetting the cardinal rule. When you lose a plane, get a bead on a tree or a feature in its line, and note that before you do anything. I didn't. I had an idea. It was pretty, because it was like on the flight line a little. I think it was a little bit behind it, is where it ended up crashing. It kind of crashed a little bit over the first hump past the end of the field, and so I was like, all right, I'll find it. Well, needless to say, the wheat that's been growing over there is chest high.
Oh wow!
So yeah, and I'm like, oh no, this is a lot harder to find. And it was getting dusk, and that's because I brought it out at the end of the day. And I did a grid pattern for about 45 minutes and found nothing. So I said, it's not the end of the world. I'm going to go. I'll put the kids in. There was it was summer break or spring break, and they had a rec center that I had signed them up for. So I'm like, I'm going to put them in rec for a couple hours while I go out and just comb the desert, as it were. So I went back out with a bunch of planes. And there's a couple guys out there who were flying their things, which was neat to see. They had some great planes to goof around with. One of the guys is about 35 years in the hobby, and another one is a newer pilot, and that he's probably been in it for 10 or 15 years. And he's pretty skilled. They both are. And the one who's in it for a while is like, he did pattern flying, and honestly, he can't get lost in the sky. Period. Like, he knows that the size of his plane will tell him exactly how far out he is and all that kind of stuff. So it was neat. It was good talking to him. But anyway, before I really got and talked to him, I went right out with my youngest son joined me, and we combed that section of field for an hour and a half. And to no avail. We did not find the plane. I think the battery ejected, because normally you kind of get close and you can at least jiggle the control surfaces and get some sort of actual servo sound and some of that gear kind of moving. And there's no weet, like none of that. There's no ESC beeping. There's no nothing. So I think the battery ejected, and so the power was off on the plane, which is good. But it also means that I had almost no hope in finding it, because I was also not going to get an RSSI signal. Because that's one of the other methods, is you point your controller at where you think the plane is, you turn 45 degrees, and then you turn back the other way, and then you basically kind of pinpoint where the signal is strongest, and that's the direction you go.
Okay, now does that involve pulling out the frequency scanner? Of an OpenTX?
No, it has an RSSI little signal indicator in the corner.
Okay.
So as you move your transmitter, it's going to be receiving better or worse signal as you turn. But without any power, it's not going to do any good. So, alas, I think I've resigned myself to losing the Eachine reptile that I've only flown halfway once. So that was a shame.
That sucks.
Oh, it does. It does. It's one of those things, though. It sat on that shelf for like 2 years. So in my mind, it was already kind of written off. Mm-hmm. And I don't know. I may end up getting another one. I'm disappointed that it went the way of the dodo. I'm hoping that come harvest time they find it, and kind of what the people who manage the farm part of the field, when they're doing their run and harvesting, they'll cut it down to the ground, and as they do, they see the planes that we've lost, and they'll pick them up before they run them out over, and oftentimes they'll put them on one of the tables under the carport.
No, that's mighty nice of them.
Yep. Apparently they really like when they're harvesting and they're doing their work. They like to see us. We're always flying. So they actually enjoy having us at the field, I think. So, it's pretty nice. So I'm hoping one day, maybe in a month or something, that plane will just sort of show up, and it'll be what it is, I guess. The bummer is
if you'll be able to salvage anything out of it at that point.
Electronics wise, probably not. I've already kind of resigned to, I don't know, maybe some of the waterproofing stuff you spray, and it's supposed to get rid of any rust and waterproof again and that kind of stuff. So if the actual device, once it's dried out, isn't rusted or the conductivity stuff isn't ruined, it might be revivable. But I'm not going to rely on it.
Right.
And I'll definitely be spraying with that stuff before I really get too far down the road, but I'm bummed out because there was some good equipment in it. Not good equipment, but there was decent enough equipment. There's a 3-cell 2200 battery. There's a 2400 23 kV motor that runs on 4-cell. I think it was just a generic 30 amp PSC, and there was a transmitter, right? There's a receiver, and then there was a video transmitter in there, because I was eventually going to make it FPV, so I figured I'd just get it trimmed out and then put FPV in it for the next time. So alas, it's a loss, but anyway, so that was a bummer. But the next day I brought out 4 planes. I brought out the Beechcraft Starship that I just finished getting ready. I put landing gear on it because I know if I can take off from landing gear, it should at least be somewhat skyworthy. That's not entirely true, but I'm telling myself that that'll be true. I have the baby SR-71. I took both of those back. Those are the ones I had tried out and realized that they were deficient in some way, and I went through those and made sure they were ready, and brought them out to the field. And then I still had, I had some issue with the SR-71. It not only was it, something was wrong, it just, the ESC motor combo, it just wouldn't start at all. Like the receiver would connect, it'd say everything was good, and then that's where it ended. And I was like, well, I can't really try this thing if the motor doesn't spin. And I tried to reset it, and it just wasn't having anything. So I was like, all right, you know what? I'll bring it back home. That's probably the best place to check it out, because if I try to get it done here, I'll be really upset. Now remember, this is after combing the field for an hour and a half. Tried the Beechcraft, and that was going really pretty good, except the landing gear I made were between the wheel diameter being pretty small and the landing gear not being tall enough. The motors, just as it started to get speed and was starting to kind of lift, the Beechcraft is a Canard pusher plane with a twin pusher. It runs on 6x4 props. They're 2204, 2300 kV motors, but they're running on, I think I have them running on 2-cell right now. Although I think I might and that's more for getting the CG right. Anyway, so as it was starting to go and every time it got enough speed, it would hit a clump of grass with the blades and ended up doing a little bit of damage to the mount. And I needed to replace a blade, a prop, because it broke one. And I was like, you know what? This is another one where even if I got it in the air, it's probably not meant to be today. Let me just, so I'm a little disappointed, but I know, trying to be not destroying my craft just to try to get it in the air. I'm like, well, I could just throw it. I'm like, no, I know me and my habits with throwing a craft. I don't know where the CG exactly is. No. That's not what I'm going to do. So I decided to bring it home and I would try it again later. So I had an epiphany about how to raise the landing gear. One of which was to increase the diameter of the wheels, and the other is to actually kind of. I have kind of like imagine if you were to open up a paper clip. That little kind of circuit that the one side would make. That's kind of how I have the landing gear, but I don't think you need all of that, so I kind of extended that by one paper clip leg, as it were. Okay. To make both of those in the back longer. And when I did that, it actually looks pretty flat and level, and the props don't hit anymore. And so I think, cross the fingers, I haven't got back out there, but it looks like that'll be the solution for that one, to at least give it an honest try. And so those two didn't work. I'm trying to think. And I flew I brought out the F-22 because that was loaded and ready. And I did another one of my famous hand launches. I made those little divots to be able to grab hold of it a little bit better. And it was going pretty good, except I couldn't get my hand back on the controls fast enough. And it essentially nosed in before I could correct. And it busted the nose. And I was like, you know what? That one's done for today. Matter of fact, that one's just done. And the nose was already twisted and warped and a little kind of off kilter. So I was looking to rebuild that plane anyway. That just was the nail in the coffin, as it were. So that was 3 out of 4. Definitely not going to fly that day. So the only other plane I had left was the Spitfire. And that's the good old trainer Spitfire that hung in the tree for 3 days.
Yep, same one. I'm glad yours survived it.
I still feel fortunate. I don't know. It was the kit with the waterproof foam board. I think that helped. And I've spray painted it. I think that also helped. But anyway, So I took it in the air. I realized like last time I went out, it had some weird tendencies. And I'm like, maybe I have a reverse prop and the motor's spinning to work with a reverse prop. But what I should have is the right size prop, because that's the way the thrust angles are. Is for a normal operating motor. So like you put on a normal prop and it spins, what is it, counterclockwise, I think, or clockwise?
It's one of those. Does Spitfire Plan's power pod have thrust angle in its?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Oh, I don't even remember that when I built mine.
Yeah, it's built in. So because of that, I'm like, let me switch it back. Because I had got another shipment of like that size prop. So I'm like, let me put that prop on. And I'll get the right one. And I'll change the direction. And it'll be ready to go. Because I had a couple things I had to fix on it. I think there's just like little maintenance things. And, put the FPV camera in there and all that stuff. And I said, cool. All right, it's time to go. So off I went. And I threw it into the air and it flew like a dream again. And so I was going right after somebody had a P-40 Warhawk. A flight test style P-40 Warhawk. He was flying his, and it was a great time. And I was like, "Hey, I'm going to join you if that's all right." He's like, "Go for it!" So I launched the Spitfire. Spitfire flew like a dream. I think it was with the battery number 2, and then I did like you and I did in the sim, and I chased them, and we had like a little kind of formation going, and then we had like a little mock combat for a second, and then I think we both realized that the odds of us hitting, because we're trying to, is little, but I think both of our collective lucks would be that we'd hit and destroy each other's plane. I'm like, I'm not looking to do that. I'm enjoying this Spitfire, and he's obviously very much enjoying his Warhawk. So So we just, kind of went back in formation. I kind of followed him around a little bit. He ended up landing, and I did a couple, acrobatics and some low speed passes and stuff like that, and just had some fun with it for, the 2 batteries I was able to put through it. And I brought it home. I said, you know what? I'm so glad that I brought this plane. It seems to be like the winter chicken dinner. It's like the one to go to because it always seems to fly well.
Mm-hmm.
So far, so good, knock on wood. And so, anyway, so we brought that home. So even though there was, I brought 4 planes up and only one made it, like 5 planes enter, 1 plane leave. So anyway, I put them away and, brought them home, and, a couple of those will see their way back out again. The F-22, the components have been pulled out. The 50 millimeter EDF is out, and I'm already looking at things I can put it back in. I know I have another plan set for the F-22 to cut out, and I'm looking forward to doing that, but I know I have a couple of things I want to tackle first. So anyway, but those are my fly stories for the last couple of weeks here. What about you, Joe?
Well, I managed to get out once to fly since last episode. And
well, you've been busy.
Yes.
You've been busy in a couple different ways. Like, work's been busy, right? Like, but you've also really made some headway with that project that's been dogging you for the last year, right?
Yeah, I try not to say that it's the same project on air, but yeah, I'm still in the bedroom doing stuff, but I about got the flooring finished up. I think I've got, say, less than 8 boards left to lay. If we weren't recording tonight, I'd be in there finishing the floor. Well,
I'm sorry to take you away from it. I'm glad you're here. And I hope it's a welcome break, but yeah, you really made some killer headway this past weekend. You went from what I guess almost the hallway finished.
No, the hallway's finished. So I don't know if I had mentioned it before, but
you mentioned that it needed to be. You had to rip it up basically, and start laying the boards all the way from the hallway.
Stuff. Yeah. So I had to relay the whole hallway. So no, I was already well into the bedroom, but it's a lot of the stair step design when you're doing that engineered flooring where you cut the board shorter as you're making new runs, and you run across sorry, I smacked my mic. As you run across the room, but yeah, so that's about done, and then from there, I get some quarter round painted, and but put some crown molding up, and then I'll be ready to start the more final phase stuff. So that's good.
The next
do.
phase,
but
good.
Yeah, that's had me kind of busy. Work has been busy, which not that it's normally not, but it's been a little extra so. And then without getting too deep into it, because it's personal, it's not hobby related, and but last week I was really down. Just mentally, emotionally, physically, just it was a rough time. And so the build night, and we'll talk about it, ended up being sort of a pickup point, which was nice. So like this last week I just didn't get out, but the previous weekend I did. I was coming home from my parents' place. My wife and I had gone out there to see them, and I had stuff in the back of the car so that maybe, if my dad wanted to go flying, we could. And it just didn't end up working out timing-wise and such. So we were on the way home, and she said, hey, why don't you, you got the stuff, why don't you go fly? And I said, I'm not necessarily in the mood, just, kind of ready to get home and that. And she pushed me to go fly. She said, you were wanting to, you haven't been able to try out the buddy box system, because I have gotten that set up. She said, you haven't been able to try that out yet, have you? So I'll go with you. And we can try the buddy. And I said, nice. Really? Yeah. And she said, yeah, I'll go with you. So we went out to, the local park not far from my house, and got out, and it was, they've closed off those parking lots again. So there's only like the little 10-car parking lot. That you can sit at. And all those parking spots were full, and cars were just parking on the side of the little driveway going in. Like, it was busy in there. You know?
Yeah.
And they don't open the gates for some reason. Like, I don't get it. There was an increase in taxes around town to be able to build this park, and they keep it locked up half the time. You know,
right?
I don't get it. Anyway, but we go out there, and there's people out walking and jogging, and you know, where you and I would, I guess, normally fly kind of that area. There was actually a family, you know, parents out with their little boy kind of playing in that soccer field. And I said, well, we can't fly here. So we kept walking, and as we were walking by, the little boy had he had a toy plane that he was kind of holding in his hand and zooming around.
Oh, neat.
And I kind of held it up and held up my old Fogey and showed it off to him, you know, and hollered over and said, hey, we're gonna be flying if that doesn't bother y'all. And you know, the dad said, you know, looked down at his boy, he said, is that okay with you? And he's like, yeah. And he said, tell them the skies are all clear. Skies are all clear. Yeah. And
That's so
cute kid stuff.
Nice.
So we walked out, and we're going to fly in a little side area, but then it ended up being a lot of people were walking or jogging by it. I said, yeah, if I lose control of this, I'm going to be over people. So we walked further, went out to a second soccer field, and started flying there. And my wife was very patient. I have a tendency to break things down very detailed when I'm explaining things and boring her and to the point that she said, Joe, put the thing in the air and let's fly.
Let's just get it going already.
So
nice.
Hand launched the Fogey, and I didn't hand it to her immediately because she had my Turnigy 9X. I had the Radio Master, and I got set up, you know, flipping a switch. Right. So I need to help you
get those. I need to help you get those sounds set up. Get the sound.
It might be beneficial, yeah. The you know, trainer plane or student plane, so that there's an audio cue.
Yeah, that's what I have in mind, and it really makes a big difference. But go ahead, keep at it. So you get it in the air.
I tossed it in the air and got it up there, and I was having to hold one direction or the other on the turning just to keep it going straight. It was more than I was going to be able to trim out of it. And, you know, I said, let me bring this down and, you know, adjust it, because I said it's too far out of whack. And so I set it down. I was trying to keep it quick because I didn't want her to lose interest and say, screw it, let's go, you know. But set it down, had to grab and I didn't bring any of my pliers or anything, so hand bending the push rod to pull that rudder into shape.
I laugh because I've done it. Yep. That's it.
And fortunately, because we're using a landscaping wire, I'm using a landscaping wire, not that musical wire, like it can handle once you put that bend in it, it doesn't lose as much strength, or there's not enough pressure within the plane's control surfaces to cause that to be a weak point. Like I was talking about my father-in-law's Simple Cub, because that's using the music wire. But got that fixed up, launched in the air, kind of trimmed it out, and I told her, okay, are you ready for it? And she kind of went through the controls again with me just to be sure, and I said, yeah, you're good to go. And she said, all right. When I've set up that trainer profile or that student profile on my Radio Master, instead of giving her complete override, I set that one up, this particular profile, so that when she gives an input, it's in addition to the inputs that my transmitter are giving in all channels except throttle. She'll have full throttle control. So I'll have to I'll tell her, throttle up to about 60%, 70%. But when she's got it, even if it's her plane, if I grab the stick and move it, the plane will respond. So
in addition to what she's doing.
Right.
So you're just sort of nudging her one way or the other if you're moving the sticks while she has it.
Right. But I can still give full input except for throttle because she's got throttle at that point, because I didn't want it adding throttle together.
No.
But
No, that's a bad idea.
if she gives it, half to the left and I'm giving it half to the left, it's going to be full to the left.
Yeah.
But I did that not so much that I could grab it while it was hers and correct her. I did that so that I didn't have to worry about trying to communicate trim over to the other transmitter.
Okay.
Because remember, you were talking about you'd had to get the trims synced up between your two transmitters.
Oh, that's what I was going to ask you, is when you started, did you compare the default setting of your trainer versus the student?
I didn't.
That's what I have to do. That's what I have to do, is I just need to double check that when I hand it over to the student, that the throw limits are similar or the same, and that the neutral points don't change. So when everything's zeroed out and I pass it to the student, that they're in the same spot. If they're not, I trim the student, because I usually know that the trainer is set, because that's I usually throw it in the air. I fly it around and make sure it flies well. It's trimmed out right. Granted, I don't do what you should do, which is then bring it to the ground and set the 0 to be where the trim is supposed to be. But anyway, so because I don't do that, what I do is I make sure that when I've already trimmed it out, when I pass the student over, that the surfaces don't shift as a neutral point. If they do, I basically go back and forth and make sure that the student trim is the same as the trainer trim. And then I check the limits to see that they're at least the same or less. Because I'm okay with the student having less authority a little bit. It's okay if they don't have as much, as long as the neutral points are the same. And that way they're not going to overcorrect. They have a less likelihood to overcorrect. But I have more throws because I might have to get it out of trouble. So I might need that. Right. That's how I have mindset. That's what I have to go through. And I was kind of curious as to what you did, which, by the way, as we talk about this, these are great training things to have under your belt, when you're looking at, helping somebody train or get a trainer set up. So go ahead.
Yeah.
So what did you have to do? So you have it set up just to pass it, and then if you have to add, you just it basically keeps the trims and passes her inputs on top of the base trim.
Right. So
okay.
Again, everything but throttle. Now, when I handed it to her, she's got complete control of throttle, and I didn't think to compare the throw reduction because first time trying it as a buddy box, so that part didn't cross my mind. But she was flying on the old Fogey profile that was on it, so I know that has reduction on it. Thinking back, but what I found, what I thought to be the importance of how I set it up was that for the left, right, and up, down, so the rudder and elevator, when I hand it off to, because it was additive, it was whatever my transmitter was saying plus whatever her transmitter was saying. If I didn't have any hands on the controls, she had full control, but any trim that I had trimmed the plane out to was still present. It didn't go away when I handed it off to her. So I didn't have to do like you were talking about, which was having to set it down and work the trim between the two transmitters, because I don't want my student to have to worry about trim at that point.
Sure.
It's okay. I've got it trimmed out. I don't want to take the time to set down and worry about trying to get the two, like, it's in the air, it's figured out, we can fly. And now that does result in, when she was flying, if she was hesitating, or I was coaching, bring it around to the right or bring it around to the left or anything like that, then if she was being a little too gentle, I could get on it and say, push it harder and say that was me, assisting you bringing it on around. So it lets me jump in easier, and then get back out without having to throw a switch to completely take control. And it is a 3-state switch that I have it on, so I could in the future set it up that the position that it's in does what it does, and then when I throw it one more position, that I have
It gives
no control.
Yeah, it gives complete control. Yeah.
Right. So, but there was a lot of, handing it off to her. She'd fly it around, and, I'd have to say, okay, turns out you need to give more throttle because, you hear that motor pitch change, and, she'd fly it around and work on bringing it back. And, I was coaching her through that, and then she'd be doing well, but then all of a sudden, like, lose orientation or lose track of some aspect of it. And I'd see the plane start to nose down or start to curl, try to roll over. And all I had to say was, I got it, flipped a switch, and I had it. And, she says, oh, you've got it? I said, yeah. So I'd bring it back. And we'd kind of talk about, while I brought it back down closer to us and worked on turning it around to set her back on the path that she was on, we kind of briefly talk about, okay, here's what I'm doing. Here's what you did. Here's what happened. You're doing well. And then, okay, are you ready for it? Are you ready? Yep. Yeah. Okay. You've got it. And I flipped the switch and she had it, and she'd fly it a little more. And then
nice.
after a couple loops of that, I'm still not entirely sure what happened. So I just handed it to her, on the say, beginning of the leg of the flight path that I had her on, and I just handed it to her. I don't know if there was some wind that day, which I had her flying into the wind, so she wasn't fighting it too bad. But the only thing I can figure is maybe she cut the throttle, in trying to get the nose to go up or to go down or something. She may have cut the throttle in addition to whatever she was doing on the sticks, because the plane just kind of like nose down and started turning, and I flipped the switch, grabbed it, went to throttle up, and I did my dumb mistake of the pull it back into one corner to try to fix the situation.
Right.
And
it's either the right corner or the wrong corner.
Right. Oh, and both of them may be wrong, because you're throwing two extreme, all elevator all the way up and rudder all the way to one side. But it would have been fine if the plane was another, because it was already like 80 feet up in the air at this point. So it would have been fine doing that if it had been another 10 feet up in the air, or if that soccer stadium light hadn't been in the way. Which is ultimately what took it out.
Yeah, those are pretty tall lights.
Sturdy too. If you didn't know. And,
I do know.
No, that fogey was just, full turn, full elevator up, and I had the throttle up trying to get her whipped around and brought back up, and you just saw, you heard it sort of before you realized what happened. You just heard this nice solid thwang, and it was beautiful to watch the motor pod eject out of the front of the fogey like a missile. It just went just shot straight, and
oh my god,
the fogey, interestingly enough, once the motor pod was gone, largely I guess it would have gone tail heavy, but
doing
because
somersaults
of the wings,
all the way down.
Yeah, because of the wings and the undercambered nature of it, the old fogey just kind of stopped and fell almost straight down, comically, like slightly rocking side to side on its way down, but it's just straight down. That wasn't spinning or anything. It was kind of rocking side to side lightly, staying upright the whole way down as it just sat just pretty as you please on the ground.
Like a parachute. Nice.
Yeah. And, there was an immediate explosion of laughter from both of us. Like, we were both doubled over laughing because just how funny it was.
That's great.
And then there started to be some other emotions that kicked in regards to,
oh my gosh, did I do that?
I just wrecked your plane, and there may have been a tear or two involved, and I had to let her know, look, I flipped the switch. I had control of the plane, but she was, I wrecked your plane. I'm like, no, you didn't. No. I had the plane. And she said, but it was doing what I thought I was telling it to. Like, that's what I wanted to. I said, I made the same mistake, but I had the plane, and I reacted poorly. And she says, I said when I took it, I've got it, but she didn't hear me. And
oh, okay.
Yeah, it's fine. But the whole time she thought she had control of it, so
fun.
it, yeah. So went over and picked it up, and the Fogey can fly again. I'll have to rebuild the power pod.
Yep.
And the stadium light when it hit. Remember that big gnarly chunk out of the side of the Spitfire?
I was about to say, like, if that Spitfire can fly again, your Fogey can fly again.
Yeah, it just looked like somebody took a fist and punched the front of the Spitfire. The front of the Fogey. It just took out the whole side section of the fuselage. But it's unimportant. It wasn't part of really the structural integrity. So I'm gonna cut that damaged foam out. I'm not even going to put new foam in. I'm going to rebuild the power pod and put it in the air.
You may want to put a new panel kind of back in so that the airflow around the section is symmetrical, because it may give you kind of nose left or right tendency because of that. But then again, that's foam board.
If it gives me trouble, I may put it back in there. But as is, I mean, you saw what the Spitfire flew looking like. So
oh my god, I still can't believe it. It's awesome. Well, so good.
Yeah, so got to use the buddy box and enjoy that. And I see what Chris was talking about, which we hadn't really talked about here, but Chris
Which
McCall,
was that?
Battle Axe, was when I was working on setting up the body box, he was saying that he had heard that some guys were saying that the wireless buddy box functionality, so the external multi-module, was it really didn't function well outside of 6 foot, and even within 6 foot, it was very, very hit or miss. And that just didn't. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me because they're both it's my transmitter's transmitting at its normal power. My multi-module, the multi-protocol module's at functioning as a receiver, but. No, when we were out there, I had to be mindful to stay in a certain position relative to her, and I had to mind the antenna angles because standing, 3 foot between us, it would drop. It didn't happen when we were in the air. I'd already figured out by that point what the limits were. But yeah, remember how you and I talked off air about how it's transmitter power. I should be able to stay at one side of the field, you at the other, and it worked. But no,
theoretically,
there's something about it that doesn't.
Well, it could be that the internal that the module on the RX setting has a limited power.
Yeah, and I think Chris was saying something about that the guys had said something about that.
It's so weird, though.
But I think it could be because the receivers now, they act much like transceivers because they pick up information, but they also transmit information back, and it could be that information going back that's the problem.
Maybe.
Even though they may, with the Turnigy, they may be capable, the receivers may be capable of telemetry, but the Turnigy transmitter doesn't have it. I'm not seeing on-screen information about it. So anyway, that's how that flight went. And then we had, you want me to go ahead and talk about what I did on the build night, or?
Give me 1 second. I've got a quick question about the trainer aspect of it. So now that you've gone through the experience, did you enjoy being able to pass that to Rachel, to your wife? And more importantly, now that she's been through it, she's been through both, right? She's been through the one where it was just her flying and good luck.
Right.
And she's been through the trainer, with a buddy box. So which did, what was her takeaway from the difference in those experiences? I'm really curious. Did you guys talk about it?
We talked about it a bit. She's not one who wants to talk prolonged about the hobby.
No.
And you know that. We get together, you and I start talking planes, and she kind of glazes over. But I think she enjoyed that better. I'm fairly certain she did, because there wasn't the concern. She, once she knew that if she gets in a bad spot, I'm going to take it, then she wasn't so worried about if something happens. But then when it did happen, she didn't hear that I took the plane. I had to tell her that I had control. You had no input over that plane at that time.
Even if she did, it's like with my son. Like, it's on me to let you get to the spot where that plane could be in danger. That's
exactly.
Me. I'm the trainer. I'm the one who's got the responsibility all the way from when it leaves the ground to when it returns to the ground, one way or the other. That's all me. As a trainer.
And I told her that too, which was, you know what? Even if I hadn't taken control of it and it had let you do the same thing that I did and smack into that pole, I said, that's still on me, because as the trainer, all I have to do is throw a switch and I've got control of the plane. It's my responsibility to make sure that, it doesn't crash. And whether I've got control of it or whether you've got control of it, it's still on me.
I know.
Part of my job is to guide you through that not happening. That was a little embarrassing that it then turned around and happened as soon as I grabbed the plane. But I had let it progress to a bad point already. I perhaps took the control back too late. At what seemed like, hey, this is fine, but come to find out, due to my reaction, I was too close to the pole. So
that's the other part about. So when your plane is high enough at a certain angle, depth perception, unless you know how far your plane is out based on the size it is, it's really hard to judge how far away your plane is. Like, I've had there's no way that thing's going to hit that, and then it smacks whatever it is you couldn't even imagine in a million years it would hit. And I've also seen, had a couple crashes. I'm like, oh, this thing's way out there. It's never going to, and I walk out, it's like 100 feet in and it's right there. I'm like, oh, well, geez, I thought I'd be walking for a long time. This is great.
Right.
and depth perception is really hard when there's no good reference points. And that's actually one of the training things that the guy at the field was talking to me about being a pattern plane guy. Is he trained himself to know how far out the plane is based on the size the plane is. He knows that when it's this size, it's this far out. And matter of fact, they even some people do some training where they'll take the same size plane and they'll do like a mock-up board and they'll stick it and they'll say 100 feet and 200 feet and 300 feet and 400 feet. And they'll basically stick it out so you could see the difference in the size of a plane as it is, as it gets further away from you. So you have like a reference as to if it's this big when it's this close, if it's this big out there, it's probably, X amount of feet out.
Yeah.
It's a good training tool if you can get away with it.
May have to look into that one day.
Yeah, no. Yeah, it's not capable in our field because we have the farm, they actually harvest regularly. So putting a bunch of signs out in the middle of their field in hopes that they don't run them down or they don't get, those signs don't get in the way is nearly impossible for us.
Mm-hmm.
But that was an interesting, I guess, training tip that I thought was something I didn't expect to hear about.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we had a build night this past Friday night, and I didn't take attendance this time. That night was actually the night I was talking about, so I wasn't sure if I was going to show up, but I did. I'm glad I did. I had a great time.
Yeah, I'm glad you did too.
And it seemed like the guys that were there had a good time. We had some returns that were at the one prior, and some guys that were there more regular. I know I was working on the it left me for a second, but I was working on the Corsair.
Yeah.
I'm still having trouble with that one because the rudder, I'll push the rudder to one side and then let it return to center, and it returns to one point. But then I'll push it the other way and let it return, and it doesn't return to the same point.
Right.
And I've put oil down the coffee stirrer, hoping to lube it up, and maybe that would help. And I've also gone in with a razor and cut some of the underside of the rudder off so that it's not catching on the horizontal stab.
Making sure it's clear. Yeah.
Right, but something inside, and I thought maybe it was the servo, so I finally like cut a lot of the inside belly section of the wing out that is largely going to be covered. When I flip it over and the belly's fully installed, you'll see that there's a piece missing, but I ended up having to tear the Metal Gear servo out, shorten the push rod, and put in a new servo, thinking my servo wasn't returned center, because I could look and I could see when I pushed it one way and then the other, even the servo I could see was slightly not centering up right. So I put a new servo in there and it's still not returning to center. So there is something somewhere in there that's gumming up. Like I felt it there. It was not an easy push. When I had removed the servo and was moving the push rod through the coffee stirrer, it was not an easy push. And I don't know if it's binding up in the coffee stirrer or if it's somewhere in one of the firewalls that are hot glued together to glue the sections of the Corsair together. Something's binding. So I want to give that a little more work. And if I can't get it right, I'm going to center that servo. So that the rudder centered, I will disconnect that servo and just let it be locked in place and just do a bank and yank on it. Yeah. Like I can't put too much more time into it, and I've put enough oil on the trying to loop stuff up. I'm worried I may not be able to paint the plane at this point.
Yeah, I suppose I didn't even think about that. I'm sure you'll be able to get it set up. I mean, it may be that
it's just spots, but
you probably have to maybe do a little light scuffing of sandpaper or something to kind of re-expose some of the fibers, and then that might be what you need, really. I had an epiphany and then I lost it. Oh, did you pull out the old servo and test it to see if it came back, if it was the servo itself after it was out of the plane and not connected to anything? Did you check that? I thought you did.
I'm not sure if I did. I'll have to check. I had to hook it up and test it sometime, because I know I tested the normal servos, the 9 gram Emax or whatever it is that we use.
The Tower.
I tested
Tower
that
Pro
before it went in, and I knew that was centering properly. But then once it was in, but then Chris, who was also at the build party, said, he had a good point, which is that servos have less torque as they're approaching center when they're trying to return to center. Is when they're moving away from that center point, and actually in motion that they have, maybe not in motion, but as they're moving away from the center point, that they're getting their torque. So it just doesn't seem to have the strength to pull it back to zero. It is ever so slightly off, but it's enough to be, a 5-degree swing either way every time I move the servo.
Yeah, we all were like, that's no way, and then we watched and we're like, oh, yeah, I guess it is. That would alarm me too. Yeah, maybe we should see about fixing that.
Because every time I touch that rudder, my flight tendency is going to change.
Exactly. Hey, did you double check your inputs? And I know this is probably not the issue at all, but did you look at the transmitter signal output values? Right?
To make sure the transmitter was returning to the same point? Yes,
because sometimes it'll be at 0, and I go left and I let go, and it goes to like -3, which may not be that 5-degree offset that we were seeing, but I guess with coupling and, depending on which holes you had it set at, it might actually turn out that way. I don't think that's the case. Again, that's pretty rare.
Yeah.
And it can be taken care of with the calibration of your sticks.
I haven't looked at that. I will. I don't think it's the issue, but in due diligence, I will check that out.
It should be a quick check to be able to see if check it off the list that it's not that. I'm just trying to help you out, because I'd love to see you have rudder when you fly that Corsair. I think you're going to, because I know you're the kind, you've done so much simming that you're used to having a rudder available. Now, maybe the RC, and I say simming as in like, Microsoft Flight Simulator. So when you're working with a Cessna style stuff, like you were using on approach, you were using rudder. Now I don't know if you've let that translate to RC or because some of your early planes didn't have rudder anyway. You just like, who cares about rudder? Let me just concentrate on this one stick.
I've not fully converted to utilizing rudder in the 4-channel RC yet, but every now and then, yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, and I know you took a lot of. It seemed like you were taking a lot of time, but I also know you were trying to be really thorough because you wanted to figure it out, and obviously it was not simple. And you also weren't looking to destroy your Corsair in the process, so I know you're being very careful. Plus, we were all talking and having a good time, so that was cool. I know. I'm trying to think of what I was doing. Let's see. I plucked out all the pieces for the Texas, the T6 Texan by the Hangar RC. So I got that started. I have started a build design challenge on the FD forums for seaplanes. So I pulled out, and again, in that effort to use it or lose it, I'm planning on tackling some of the old projects that almost had flight, going back and just kind of either restoring them or rebuilding them and giving them another go. But as with all kind of challenges, I like to tackle something new. So I'm also planning to tackle the Junker JU-1000, which is like a 1920s, I'll call it a concept airliner. Whereas they called it a flying wing, but back in those days, it was mostly wing and not much tail or rudder. It was a flying wing, even though it had rudders and it had an elevator and it had rudder pieces and stuff. It's not a pure flying wing like some of the other models that came out later. But it was still, it's predominantly, it looks like, I don't know, it looks like Aladdin's shoes. Are like two shoes of Aladdin's are sticking on the bottom of a wing, and it's got a flying canard elevator in the front, sticking off of the toes of each of those shoes of the genie. I don't know how else to describe it. It's just a weird looking thing, but it's a neat plane. And so I spent a little bit of time at the very end, kind of hucking out a chuck glider version of it just to see if where I had the hunch on the center of gravity, if it was close. And I think it's pretty close. But unfortunately, it has a tendency to do one of two things. If it's obviously a little bit tail heavy, what it does is it flutters backwards and it'll do kind of like backwards loops. Okay. So it's getting too much lift compared to where the CG is. And it kind of toils around because the canard is set at about 5 to 6 degrees above the plane of the angle of attack of the wing itself. Or I put a little bit too much, and then not only does it start going down, but it continues that moment. So it doesn't just sort of like go nose down and just go faster. It goes down and keeps nosing in. So it's like it accelerates into the ground even faster. By the time it hits the ground, it's at 90 degrees and going fast. I'm like, oh. And so every time it hit, it's surprisingly very resilient because that canard still stuck on there. I can't tell you how many times I nosed it in before I'm like, oh, but the angle would change because it kept kind of squishing the toes of the shoe, I guess. Anyway. I got a good kind of sense of it, and I think a bigger model, I'm just going to build the full scale deal and see if I can't maybe play catch with one of the kids and see, or maybe if we get a chance to get together, maybe that'll be part of what we do, is kind of toss it back and forth and hope that we can find the right CG. I've done a CG calculator, so again, I'll put it there and hope that that's really close. Anyway, so... those are, I'm trying to think, what was the other thing I did? Oh, I built the Mustang, or at least half of it. I built the wing, and I punched out all the stuff, and I glued that. So it was an FT Mustang. So I tackled those 3 planes in the build night. It was a lot of fun. listen to everybody else's stories and watch what they were building. And we had people building balsa and foam board and just kind of talking about stuff that's going on. It's good.
And having a good time.
Absolutely. So I guess that brings us to our topic, trainer planes. And so for the next, a couple episodes, we're going to talk about the different eras of trainer planes. This episode, we'll talk about what makes a trainer plane, or what kind of tendencies do trainer planes have that other planes may not. And then we'll talk about trainer planes in World War One as we continue on some of the historical aspects of planes. So, so one of the things the trainer planes are known for is a high chord thickness to chord length. So they tend to be sort of fatter wings, in part so that one of the things about trainer planes, they tend to be slower. You don't really want a speed demon for somebody's first plane. Just like when you give your teenager a car to go learn on, you're not going to give him your sports car. You're going to give him the grocery getter or the old sedan, the good old trusty sedan that doesn't have a ton of pickup. He's not going to be able to burn out or anything like that. So you want it to give the pilot, specifically with trainer planes, you want to have this plane give the pilot enough time to react to situations they're not used to, as well as that it has enough operational window so that it doesn't have dangerous tendencies. So you want a gentle stall characteristic. You don't want this thing to just start plummeting out of the sky when you hit the stall, because if you don't know what you're doing as a pilot, you might get to a stall pretty quick and not realize it. And if it all of a sudden starts dropping out of the sky, you might start to panic. So gentle characteristics on a stall are a good example, as well as, you want to be able to hit a high angle of attack before the stall. Some wing characteristics will, a couple extra degrees of angle of attack, and all of a sudden you're coming close to the stall. Other things is you kind of want a high, you don't want to have a high drag ratio, but it is more desirable to have a higher drag ratio compared to other styles of planes. Like when you're looking at a sport plane or an acrobatic plane or a jet, although, and we'll get into trainer jets later. And so these things are actually universal to most, both full-scale aircraft and RC aircraft. These are important characteristics because a pilot is a pilot is a pilot. You're still learning to fly, whether you're doing it from the ground or in the plane. And it's probably more important in a full-scale aircraft. One of the other things, we'll talk about some other things you'll note on most trainer planes. So most trainer planes, if not all of them, they will have the fuselage below the wing. And the reason that is an advantageous situation is that means that the natural position, all the extra weight of the motor and the pilot or the battery, in our case, as an RC pilot, are below the wing. So they're naturally going to pull the wing to a down-facing position. So basically, so that it returns to upright level and forward flying position. Okay. Whereas if it was on top, the natural tendency is for that weight on top to kind of flip over, right? Which isn't necessarily going to happen, and if you've designed the plane right. But as a trainer, you want if you can, you want the weight below. We talked about the high wing aspect ratio of wing depth to chord length, which is basically the leading edge to the back edge, versus the depth of the wing itself, the height of the spar, basically. One of the other things you'll note that there will be a dihedral, and that is a feature that allows the plane to return to a neutral level position on its own. So if you have a plane and let's say the pilot, let's say goes unconscious for a minute, a plane with dihedral will return to the neutral position on its own slowly.
Mm-hmm.
You know, with it, given everything else is going okay. The throttle's about where it should be. All the surfaces are neutral, that kind of stuff. The plane
But it
will
also
return.
just makes it easier for flying straight.
Because if you are correcting one direction, it will naturally try to bring you back around to flight straight and level, which is
Now, is dihedral necessarily present in all trainers, or is it just some? Because I would have thought of a Cessna 182, or what you think of as a private aircraft, that Cessna. I don't recall that it had dihedral in it.
It does.
Okay.
So dihedral angle is typically between 3 to 6 degrees. If you're using ailerons in an RC plane, you're typically going to have only up to 3 because you have less effectiveness of the ailerons if it's 6 degrees. So the higher the angle, the less the ailerons are going to effectively roll the plane, I guess,
Okay.
in an even fashion. So the closer they are to neutral, the more balanced, I guess, the effects of each aileron are going to be.
Okay.
And the other thing is trainers are going to have, they're going to have about 3 to 5 degrees of, some are going to have wing washout. It's going to be about 3 to 5 degrees. You're going to also have an angle of attack that's anywhere between, I think, 2 and 5 degrees. And I think we talked a little bit about thrust angles. Trainers are basically going to have also 2 to 3 degrees down and right thrust angle to counteract the torque. And there's actually, I think, 3 different types of torque that happen in a plane. There is the actual washout from the propeller that rotates around the plane and ends up hitting the rudder. There is the actual torque of the motor itself that's trying to rotate the plane. Because if everything's equal, the only thing resisting the motor from spinning the plane is the wings. So there's naturally a torque there, as well as I think you also have, because there's a slight angle of attack, you're going to have a slightly increased amount of thrust on one side of the propeller versus the other. And again, all of those effectively get countered by a slight down and right thrust angle. So if there's a listener probably shouting at their podcast or at their radio going, no, that's not how it is. Write in, let us know, please. Let us know what's going on.
Now you had mentioned wing washout. I'm familiar with prop wash, but not wing washout.
Yeah, so basically it's the very trailing edge of the wing will oftentimes have a slight up tilt, and what that ends up basically creating a counter moment to the lift. And so rather than having the upper surface of the wing airflow pushing down and actually creating a downward force, creating kind of a lift at the rear edge of the wing. It's a minor lifting force. If you have a little bit of washout, it actually returns that airflow to normal, to the plane's direction of flight.
Okay.
And therefore there will not be an additional lift. So that basically kind of returns things to even and has no additional tendencies, I guess, towards that. Yeah. So trainer planes often have, if it's not, so what you'll have is you have most trainer planes have a Clark Y cross section, which is a flat bottom and the traditional airfoil on the top. I think there's a standard ratio. I can't remember what it is. I think it's actually 1:10, but don't quote me on that one. But if you notice, there's also a Clark Y H, and the H is actually the one with a little bit of washout. And those two are probably the predominantly used ones in every trainer you'll see. Again, I'm sure there's exceptions to all this, just like any good hobby. There's exceptions all over the place, but that tends to be the rule more than the exception, I think.
Okay. Well, so you had brought up wing loading, and
yes,
I've become a little familiar with that, but talk about wing loading for a second, if you would.
Okay. So one of the things you're going to note is like wing loading is how much weight per lifting area of the plane. Right. So you have a wing that has a certain amount of area, it has a certain amount of lift for that wing, and basically it's lift versus its weight. And then one of the ways you can do it is you can measure. There's a whole formula. Let me see. I think I could find it. It's like density of the air times velocity squared times the wing's lifting coefficient, which like a Clark-Wise starts at like 0.7, and as the angle of attack increases from the 2 or 3 or 0 you might have it at, that's like a 0.7 lifting coefficient. It goes all the way up to about 15 degrees before the air separates from the wing and it stops creating lift. And at that point, it's a 1.5 lifting coefficient. So that's basically saying that airspeed is doing 1.5 times what it would normally do, all things being equal, I guess. And then times the wing area. So the more wing area, the more lift you get. The faster you go has a bigger impact than the wing's area, right? Because it's squared.
Okay.
So given that, you take the wing lifting force and you divide it by the weight, and that's like basically that's your I don't know, there's a couple different things. There's the lifting ratio and the drag ratio, which are, if you look at airfoils, they'll have a whole bunch of curves, and they'll be, for a given airfoil, there'll be a lift and a drag, and you can compare those two, and they kind of give you an idea as to how that kind of wing is going to perform for your aircraft. But the biggest thing, I think, what people do is they take that wing loading coefficient and they'll take the lifting force divided by the weight, and what they'll do is they'll actually try to figure out the cubic loading, and the reason why you want to do that is because no matter what size the plane is, the cubic loading coefficient is actually going to give you a more honest understanding as to how that plane will perform. And basically the cubic wing loading is the weight, dividing the weight by the wing area raised to the 1.5 power. So like a traditional Cessna has a cubic wing loading of 13 ounces per cubic foot, which is, I guess, when you start looking, and we'll talk about the windows. I think we've talked about them before, but this is where, when you're designing a plane or you're looking at the plane and trying to understand how it's going to perform in the air, you look at these guidelines, and that'll tell you kind of how they're going to perform. The other thing you want to look at maybe would be the glide ratio, was if you throw the plane, or if you cut the throttle on a plane, it will go a certain amount of feet forward for 1 foot of drop. Or you can do it in meters. It'll be the same ratio.
Mm-hmm.
So sailplanes will be, let's say, 60 feet. Like a really good sailplane will be 60 feet forward for 1 foot of drop. And again, don't quote me because I don't have these numbers in front of me, but I do know that like trainer planes will be like 13 per 1, and you'll have sport planes will be more like 8 to 1, and then you'll have like jets, I think, are even less. They'll be more like a 4 to 1, because really they're relying on the speed to keep them up in the air.
Right.
So based on those kinds of things, you'll kind of have an idea. Now, the cubic loading, again, when you use that formula, which will either be in ounces per cubic foot or it'll be grams per cubic meter. But I'll give you the cubic loading, and it ends up, I think, it's going to be the ounces per cubic foot is what I'm going to give you. So sail and park flyers are going to have 4 to 7 ounces per cubic foot. And then sport and trainers will be 7 to 9. Pylon and scale will be up to 13. And electric ducted fans will be 25. So that's 25 ounces, which is 1.5 pounds per cubic foot, which is compared to like a sailplane, which is 1/4 pound per cubic foot. So you can see that there's a big difference in how the plane is loaded, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why they do the cubic loading is because when you start scaling a plane from full scale down to like a scale plane, all the air doesn't change how it behaves. So the performance tendencies tend to be a little bit different. But the cubic loading tends to be an honest value of how the plane will perform based on its size and loading and shape of wing and all that stuff. It kind of takes all that into consideration, and it gives you an apples to apples comparison. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So when you're looking at a lot of different values, you're looking at like how much your plane weighs, how big the wing is it going to fit in my car? And one of the things you want to look for is what's the cubic wing loading. And the reason why you want to do that is because you want to see what kind of performance can I expect out of this plane. You think you know what it's going to be, but it's better if they can tell you. You can look it up and kind of have a better understanding for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We can get into, maybe we'll go some other time later, talk about designs of trainers, but because there's some guidelines on like how big the ailerons are in comparison to the overall size of the wing, how big the wing is, like trainer planes, where you're going to put the landing gear. Landing gear on a trainer plane is typically going to be either at the leading edge if it's a tail dragger, or just behind the CG if it's going to be a tricycle gear, because you want it to be able to lift off pretty easily. Right. You don't want to have it spend a lot of time on the ground. So what you want is also, the other thing is, on a trainer plane, you want to set the throws low. What you don't want to be so low that the plane isn't responsive, but you also don't want them to be so high that you're having a natural tendency for a inexperienced pilot would be to overreact to a situation. So if the throws are a little bit lower, it allows like a slower reaction, a slower response of the plane, so that gives the pilot more time to react. But you don't want to be so slow that you can't get out of a situation, right?
Right. And I know that we've kind of talked about this before, but briefly, what with say a trainer setup, would you want throw reduction, or would you want more exponential, or a mix of the two?
You want throw reduction, definitely, because again, an inexperienced pilot will tend to go straight to the corners when they start to panic.
Hi.
Yeah. Pardon me.
You good?
Yes. Yeah, I'm good. Yeah. Right. And I'm right in that boat with you. Which means so that when you throw them to the extremes, they're not going to be too much that are basically going to bring your plane out of control. I think I had also flown the Polaris, and I had the throws too high, and it rolled a lot quicker than I expected. And if I was smart, I would have reduced the throws, and it would have been easier to manage, and I might have been able to bring it home. But yeah, that's really important. And having Expo is important because it allows for that finer control in the center of the stick. And it makes it easier for minor adjustments. Because if you have something linear, that's going to be so hard to keep going straight and level as a new pilot. Even as an experienced pilot, it's hard.
They make me feel bad because I don't run Expo.
Dude, you need to put Expo 30%. Start there.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I'm telling you. No, maybe. Do it. You'll thank yourself later. I promise. But basically, the whole point of a trainer plane, in summary, is that you want it to be forgiving, right? You want it to have enough room and space and enough performance characteristics so that the pilot can recover from mistakes that they're inevitably going to do. And with that, one of the best tips to do that with is, if you don't have anybody to be there with you with a buddy box, the buddy box is really one of the greatest training tools you can use. That and a simulator where you can crash it ad nauseum until you learn what you're doing wrong without having it cost anything. That's one way. And the other way is the buddy box, is that you have somebody who understands how to fly the plane comfortably and can get you out of a situation you may not be able to get out of yourself. And have them there with you. That gives you a certain level of confidence that you're not going to crash what you're trying to fly. Anyway, so those two are probably the best method. But like we were talking about a little earlier, like sometimes you just gotta, if you're doing it like we are, there's nobody around. You just tuck it in the air and, set yourself up for success. Keep the throws low. Put in Expo. Start it at 75% throttle, give you enough throttle to get you in the air, get yourself up 3 accidents high, and then go have some fun. So, and use a trainer plane, because again, they're designed to give you the space to make errors.
Yeah.
And get you out of them.
And the built-in functionality, the built-in designs to kind of passively help you recover from them.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly. You got it. Well, good. So I guess that kind of brings us to our history. So let's learn a little bit about some World War I trainer planes. This is kind of where aviation took hold, right? The Wright brothers started their flights in the beginning of the 19th century. And by like 5 years later, it was hot to trot. And a little bit later after that, World War I broke out. And soon generals understood that having an aerial vantage point created a significant advantage in the battlefield. Understanding where people were, what they were doing. And later they kind of realized, well, they could drop munitions from those things too. And then once they realized how important that was, then aerial combat became a thing, and now you started to need fighter planes who could be maneuverable, but easy to fly, because nobody was a pilot at that point. There were very few people who knew how to fly a plane.
Mm-hmm.
But
I mean, you figured it, and I just did a quick Google double checking dates. You figure World War I was just 11 years after the Wright brothers made their flight.
Yeah. I mean, dang. To me, it's like 10 years. All of a sudden, everybody's like, let's do it. It's all in, Wow.
Right.
That's pretty incredible. And to think about how the plane went from being something that was just this fragile, I'll call it delicate mess, and almost barely controllable, to something that they're playing, and we'll talk about it, but they're playing table tennis across the top of the darn thing. Standing out on these wings, doing some crazy stuff. And in this scant, 10 years? That's incredible. I mean, just straight out incredible.
Yeah.
So we're just going to cover, and there's a lot of really great early, I'll call it trainer planes in World War I. One could argue almost every plane in that era is sort of a trainer plane, because nobody knew how to fly them anyway. But during the war, there seemed to be each major force had a plane that they leaned on as their kind of go-to for the one to stick new pilots in, to teach them how to fight, how to fly, and they were good enough where they were functional in the field, not just as a trainer. So we're going to talk about the Jenny, the Curtiss Model J N-1 I think 1 through 6, and I think the JN4 was kind of the big platform there. So yeah, they combined the Model N and their Model J, and it became the Model JN, which started to be nicknamed the Jenny, which is how it got its name. And they made 6 different variations, and I think the 4 was the one that was purchased most by the U.S. Army. This is the U.S. trainer plane. So the early versions of the Curtiss plane were served the U.S. Army before America's entry into World War I, and it originally had a 90 horsepower engine. But as the likelihood that we were going to enter war, they upgraded the engine to a 150 horsepower plane, which increased. And as you might imagine taking like an APAC motor and switching it out for like a B or a CPAC motor. Mm-hmm. And just be like, oh my gosh, so an 1806 with like a 2812 or something like that, like a significantly larger motor. It of course increased its performance significantly. So it allowed it to climb and do maneuvers a lot simpler. And it was as a pilot, it was easier to manage the plane when you were flying it. So Jennies were used to train 95% of the American airmen who learned to fly. Can you imagine that? Because before that point, there was no Air Force.
Right? Okay. Yeah, I guess. And even the Air Force wasn't necessarily a thing at this point. It was still an extension of the Army.
Exactly. Yeah. And so there's like a handful of people who even knew how to fly or had any experience at all. And so what they did is they used this model to train nearly 95% of all American. It's just incredible to me that like pretty much everybody who ever knew how to fly learned to fly through the military on this plane. Right?
Right. And it had to have been doing its job well.
Yeah, it did. It was acrobatic. It was maneuverable. It was sturdy, and it was easy to learn on. One of the things that you'll notice, that's the other thing I forgot to mention. Most trainer planes are tractor planes, and there is a reason for that. I know when we start as a trainer, I oftentimes recommend a pusher for RC pilots because it keeps the propeller off of the ground, like the propeller becomes protected, as well as I'm trying to remember. It also creates a couple other beneficial properties, but that's a big one because when you're going to tank it. Oh, that's the other thing is when you dump it in the ground, you're going to maybe hurt the nose of the plane, but that's not going to destroy the prop or the motor, or it's not going to cause the C to overheat because the prop isn't moving, though you have a full throttle. Right. So it allows you to like a little bit of leeway as a new pilot. But in the real plane, the problem with if there was a crash, that motor would keep going forward, and it ended up causing a lot of death of airmen. And so they quickly realized that the Army only wanted tractor planes to train with.
That makes sense.
It does. I just something I didn't realize. So we brought those planes and other high performance, basically biplane and triplane craft over with us to help, be part of World War One. But of course, the war ends, right? And now the Army has all these planes they don't really need. So they start putting them at the surplus. And what does the Army do with surplus but sell it to the awaiting public? Right. So it was used to a lot of people. That was most Americans. Their first airplane ride was in a Curtiss Jenny. And while others used it to do some wild flying stunts because it was very acrobatic and maneuverable. So they were showing off like all these neat things that they could do in these planes that most people didn't think were safe to do, which, I mean, maybe they weren't safe. Arguably. But they knew, the pilots knew that they could perform these stunts and still, and put on a show and make some money. And their whole business was most of the time the businesses of these, they called themselves barnstormers after a while, ended up being pretty haphazard. But they performed an important function, though, because after the war, aviation kind of, otherwise aviation would have kind of dropped off. Like if nobody really needs to be in the sky, then okay. But it kept the aviation in the public eye, because people go out to these air shows and these local flying circuses and see these crazy people do these amazing acrobatics in the air. And so it kept everybody's public eye on during these lean years that followed the war. And in general, it basically introduced the whole country to private and commercial flying, and that it was there and possible. And of course, anytime there's a spectacle, what happens?
Yeah. Hollywood wants to get involved.
That's right. You can make money on it. Let's make a video. So Hollywood gets involved. And of course, as they're releasing flicks, they would also release these highlight reels of, crazy things happen around the world or happening around America, right? So they created these spectacular stunts, and that they would film from a different plane of these flying circuses that would roam the rural America, and they try to capture them on film. And they do crazy stuff all across the country to get audiences. And, they'd be stunned in silence as they watched. I think it was Ormir Locklear would hang upside down from the wingtips of a Jenny. Or there'd people who would be playing table tennis, basically tennis across the top of the wing. They'd get out of the plane that they were flying, get on the wing, and start playing tennis, and then get back in the plane and keep flying.
Yeah, I kind of remember seeing those old black and whites at some point.
Yeah, exactly, right. And then there was, I guess, an aerialist named Gladys Ingle, and she would climb out onto one of the Jenny's wings and then go from one plane to the next. So the planes would get right next to each other, and she would walk across the top of the wing from one plane to the next and back again.
Jeez.
I know. And I guess, really, these planes never really went that fast. There's so much drag area and so much lift. So they never really went too terribly fast. So it's not like they were, modern day planes, you'd be, shoved off the wing in 2 seconds. But these were going slow enough where, you could do that. Like standing in a car.
And I should point out, because I didn't realize this until you sent me, if you hadn't sent me the pictures and the document on this, I wouldn't have known. But the Jenny's a biplane.
Yes.
Which helps allow it to be able to fly at those lower speeds.
It's a wire reinforced box frame double wing.
Okay.
So basically the cables are trussing it together in a box cross style thing. It keeps the wing rigid. And then they have the two wings are tied together. The bottom wing is attached to the fuselage. The top wing is set on top of these box vertical formers, basically, and it's kept rigid by the wires. And I believe, I'm trying to think, they have ailerons on both top and bottom wings on the Jenny. And that's not initially, and I think that was the case with most, but you'll hear about the German aircraft that did not do that. And yet it was still very effective. Okay, but to finish up the Jenny story, there were stunt groups like the 13 Black Cats and Flying Aces who became legendary. I mean, I think we still use the term Flying Aces. I don't think we realize where some of that might come from. I think we think it's military, but and looking at this history, I think that term comes from the flying circus that would do these crazy stunts. And they would literally fly through barns and things like that, all while being filmed by these crazy cameramen who are risking their lives to try and get this stuff on film as well. So it's not just the people doing these crazy acts, but it's the cameramen who are willing to put their lives on the line to get this this stunt and this crazy act on film and bring it to the public. So, and then of course, what happens when all that's over? Right? The war's over. The planes are in surplus, and they're available for people to buy. And almost everybody, literally 95% of all airmen, anybody who touched a plane during that time, their planes, the experience that they have has almost always been with the Jenny, at least first. So that's like their first love of flying. And they would get, so they'd be the people's first contact with airplanes or flying was the Jenny. And it got thousands of them safely into the air and back down again. So people had a lot of love for this aircraft. Moreover, it was this type of flying and these pilots that created the need for more airports and better runways. Plus, and so they started to create a whole industry around flying. Plus, they started talking about like needing rotating beacons for night flying. And now all of a sudden, you're not restricted to just flying at day. You can fly longer hours and further distances. And less intentionally, they also pointed up the need for better controls and better regulations to make flying safer and more dependable. As kind of a byproduct of having more and more planes in the air, people start going, oh, geez, we need to do something about this, right?
Yeah, there's got to be some protocols and methodology to this.
Yeah, otherwise, who knows what's going to happen, right? Okay, so from the ranks of these early pilots came the aviators who founded commercial aviation. So you have Charles Lindbergh's first aircraft was a Jenny. Amelia Earhart learned to fly in a Jenny. And many of them built permanent hangars and offered charter services and flying instructions. Many others competed for government airmail contracts and went on to establish the first regularly scheduled air carrier routes and the same routes that were later flown by passenger airlines. Behind this chain of developments was, of course, the Jenny, and which was all pioneered by airmail services prior to 1920. So without the Jenny, aviation in America probably wouldn't be what it is today. It's pretty cool. So I guess that brings us to the next plane. We're going to talk about the SE-5. That's the British, the Royal Aircraft Factory, or RAF, as it's often known. If you aren't familiar with that term, I mean, you see it with the RAF this or that. That's why. It's the British Air Force, basically.
Okay.
And so the Scout Experimental 5, or the SE-5, it was designed by, I guess, Henry Folland and John Kenworth and Major Frank Gooden over at the Royal Air Force. It was, and that's the other thing, is these planes, I believe the Jenny was armed with 2 guns, 2 machine guns. And the neat thing about these guns was that they were set up so they could not fire when the propeller was in front of the muzzles.
Yeah. And I've kind of seen or heard about this kind of stuff as like years past. There had to be a mechanism. And I think they tied directly into the, do I want to say a distributor cap on the motors? Because
yeah, I think so.
It, depending on when that bullet fired, you'd actually shoot bullets through your prop and shoot your prop straight off.
Exactly. I can only imagine a poor sap who found that out the first time. Oh no. Anyway, I laugh at it now only because it's not a thing anymore.
Right.
So
it could be a thing, but we know now to put those mechanisms in place. And
yeah,
we also mount the guns differently so they're not away. And I mean, we're jets mostly now when it comes to fighters.
Nowadays.
So
yeah, it's a totally different style of warfare for sure. The SE-5 obviously designed as some sort of scout plane, and that in World War I was probably its primary function, was to go up in the air and kind of see what the enemy was doing and report back. And eventually, like you said, you eventually had to realize you might get into a dogfight. You might get into a fight. So they then this one was equipped with a single gun. But the other thing is they also had 4 bombs strapped on the underside of the plane. I guess a ripcord or something that would release the bombs when it was time. I know in some other planes, especially in some of the earlier bombers, they would basically just have a front copula that just had hand-dropped bombs. And there would be a guy who'd look over the edge and go, yep, that looks right, and just pull them out and drop them. And back in those days, that's just how it was done. And I guess as the planes got faster, that just became less possible, right? Because you needed to be protected from the wind as it started to move at the speeds World War II aircraft were going.
Right.
But in World War I, that wasn't the case. So you could literally just lean out the side of your plane and drop a couple. Okay. So the interesting thing about the SE-5, and part of what I think sets it apart from some of the other planes, is much like its other craft around it, which were really agile, but they also weren't very forgiving. So if you messed up, you messed up, and you may not recover from it, like with tip stalls and things like that we'll see in some of the planes we build ourselves in the scale community. It was incredibly stable and easy to fly, which also enabled pilots to be a lot more accurate with their firing, because they could actually keep the plane steady and not have to constantly correct for it. So they could line up a shot and keep at it. And they actually had a lot more success being able to fire upon their enemies who were further away, and be able to, and with a little bit more accuracy. And consequently, it was enough to give it a leg up compared to some of its counterparts. Yeah. I never would have thought that a more stable system would be a better thing for a fighter, even if it's less maneuverable, So the cockpit was in the middle, which one of the drawbacks was that it had a long fuse in the front, so it's hard to see past. But basically, once you were flying and in the air, if you didn't have to look down a little bit, you could see all around you well, because you were in the middle, you were a little bit behind the wing, and you had good visibility left and right. See, that's also a biplane, and one of the greatest advantages that it had over the Sopwith Camel, which is another major plane that was used by the British in that time period, is that the SE-5 had superior performance at altitude. So it could handle maneuvers and throttle out of things, and the engine performed better at higher altitudes, which means, if they wanted to outperform, if they're in a dogfight and they needed to get an advantage, they would just start flying higher. Which ended up making it actually a much better match for its counterpart in the German Air Force, the Fokker D7 VII, the 7, and which could also fly at higher altitudes. So where the Germans brought out this plane, the most of the Air Force of the British and American forces couldn't handle that altitude. This plane was one of the few that could go up and give it a toe-to-toe fight. Which a lot of people argue that the SE-5 was one of the best aircraft that the British had for fighting in World War I. Well, as with all things, the war has to end, and somebody's got to do something with these things. So the SE-5 was found that the very first example of skywriting for advertising had happened when Cyril Turner, who was a former RAF officer, he spelled out London Daily Mail in black smoke out of the back of an SE-5 at a big event, I guess called the Derby. The SE-5 was also used in air races and had won the Morris Cup in 1927. So it continued on as an air staple from that point forward. Okay, and the last one would be talking about the German Air Force and their trainer plane, which ended up being the Fokker DR-1. So German...
I want to clarify that's spelled F-O-K-K-E-R.
Yes. F-O-K-K-E-R. Thank you. Maybe honestly, I might be pronouncing it wrong. It might be Fokker. I don't know. So
I don't. Yeah.
Write in and
German,
let us know.
I don't know.
Yeah, write in and let us know. So it's a German triplane, and it kind of sets itself apart by there's only ailerons on the upper wings. It had a 110 horsepower engine, which again, when you compare it with the American Curtiss Jenny, which started out with a 90 and moved up to 150, you think that it kind of has a lackluster, I guess, engine, but it's enough to make itself a pretty terrifying name in the fighter, aircraft fighter stuff for World War One.
So engine size is always so big, it's always so much a component of a plane's overall performance. There's enough other factors that can come into it.
That's true. Yeah, and of course we see that in the RC world too. You build this little tiny plane and it floats and flies awesome on this little tiny, almost nothing motor. And you build a giant plane with what seems like a massive motor and it seems undersized.
Yeah.
And you're like, geez, well, I thought this would do better. Anyway, so back to our German trainer plane. So the Fokker DR-1 was made famous. Actually, so it came about as the British Sopwith triplane had crashed behind enemy lines, and the Germans had basically looked at it and dismantled it and started to figure out, why it was designed the way it was. And one of the reasons why all of the German planes started to basically mimic the Sopwith triplane was because the German Air Service General von Hoppner had publicly praised this the Sopwith triplane as being, I guess, incredibly effective. So at that point, the German aircraft manufacturers said, okay, we need to create something that meets this, if not exceeds it. And so they all went to work at coming together and putting something that they would do, in fact, that. And Anthony Fokker, I'm going to call him Fokker because now I feel like I'm saying, meet the Fokkers. And that's, Anyway, Anthony Fokker, he ended up being successful, and he ended up basically, because he had flown a Sopwith triplane, so he'd actually experienced what the flying characteristics were like. And he also studied the crashed one firsthand, so he kind of had some inside knowledge, and he used that to create the Fokker DR-1. And it was made, and it's the plane that everybody knows as the pilot Manfred von Richthofen. He's known more famously as the Red Baron. Yeah, the Red Baron flew a DR-1. And he basically claimed 60 his 60th success with that. So basically shot down over 60 planes on 60 attempts of flying. He would basically take down a plane every time he went up into the air, which is a pretty big record at the time. Werner Voss, who is one of the other manufacturers at the time, or one of the other, he's a top pilot at the time. He claimed 20 confirmed kills in just 24 days in his DR-1. He was killed on the 23rd when 6 SE-5s attacked his DR-1. Other German aces who flew the DR-1 had incredibly great successes, such as Erich Lohenhardt, who ended the war with 53 kills, and Ernst Udet, who had 62 kills by the time World War I had ended. At a certain point, so it was its incredible rate of climb and its ability to turn swiftly that made it so lethal in a dogfight. However, it wasn't very fast compared with the Allied fighters in that time period of 1917 to 1918, but it was incredibly maneuverable and agile, and because of that, it tended to outweigh the problem that it wasn't as fast.
Right.
And obviously, you can tell the record of successful kills, I guess, during a pilot's tenure, right? Which I imagine were pretty short. And then basically, there really weren't that many. There's about 171 aircraft at the peak. And after a while, it was overtaken by the DR-2. So the next version of it was a better aircraft. So what they ended up doing was moving the DR-1s to defensive positions, like behind homeland lines, I guess. And they basically became the second line of defense in their fighters. So anytime, I guess, allies would break past the front lines, these would be back to defend the homeland.
So when you say there was like 171 peak, was that like total available to be in the air at a given time, or was that just the total number produced?
It wasn't very clear, but the way I read it is that there was 171 at one point.
Okay.
I don't think that was total produced. Although it could be.
Not that it matters too much. I just remember you'd sent me the information on that Jenny before.
And that was like thousands.
Yes, thousands of them produced, to the point that the U.S. actually had to outsource to Canada to be producing a lot of them. So, yeah. And I thought that was incredible, the difference in the quantity. But ultimately, you know, the Fokker DR-1 was not the only German plane in the air, right? It was not the only one that made their contract. So, you know. And so the post-war stuff, after the Treaty of Versailles was passed at the end of World War I, it forbade having a German Air Force. So, of course, the DR-1 basically was then, I guess, taken by France and used for whatever France used it for. I guess that's right. Defensive. I forgot that was a condition of the end of the war.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It's one of the major aspects that, not that piece, but that general sentiment of we will strip you of all abilities to do anything for the next foreseeable future. That pretty much was what preceded World War II. Yeah,
kind of set the stage for all that going down.
Yeah, it sure did. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so those are three aircraft for the three major forces in World War I. Those are the aircraft that they oftentimes trained their officers and their new airmen with. And I mean, everybody was a new airman, I think, at that point anyway. So it was pretty incredible to see that in a scant, 10 years, what the Wright brothers, I guess, invention had led to.
Yeah. It's, I mean, 10 years of design and development. Like, we see how quickly things move today. But just thinking about, you know, in my mind, when I think back and I just see, like, in, I don't want to say technology eras, but to see that, like, today we move so fast because there's so much information and processing power at our disposal. But, you know, you see that, you know, steam was so long, and then, you know, we started getting into the, you know, manufacturing and this, that, and the other. But just the thought that, you know, the Wright brothers flew, and then, you know, 11 years later in World War I, there was all that going on.
Yeah.
You know, and not just that Wright brothers flew in the U.S., therefore U.S. has airplanes. Just, you know, all over the world they were working on it. So,
yeah, it was all over the place.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Well, thank you for your research in all this.
Yep. We'll have links to where we pulled some of that information from if you want to go and look into it a little bit more. I mean, I feel like I only scratched the surface. But so you're welcome to go in and get into it if you want. Let us know how we did, if you want us to get deeper, or if it was too much, if you'd like to have us skim over things like that a little bit more, let us know. Love some feedback. Mm-hmm.
It's a little different format for us, but it's stuff we're interested in learning, and so we want to share it with you guys as we go.
Mm-hmm.
So, Matt, let's talk about what's going to be on our workbenches, or what is on our workbenches very briefly, and then we'll get out of here?
Yeah, sounds like a good plan.
Okay.
Why don't you go first, Joe? Why don't you tell us what you're working on?
Well, I'm continuing to work on the Corsair.
Good.
So I'm thinking at this point I'm going to pull the rudder's push rod out and go back in with the landscaping wire and use that as a push rod and see if that somehow doesn't overcome the bind situation. But I'm probably also going to rip that coffee stirrer out of the equation and just do a straight.
Yeah, the landscaping wire will probably have enough rigidity where you won't need the stirrer.
Right. And so I'm also thinking maybe there's some flex happening in the music wire.
Could be.
I do also need to rebuild the power pod for the Fogy and kind of cut that excess bit out. And like I said, I want to give the Corsair a little more work before I give up on that rudder and just lock it in place and let's maiden this baby. And
yeah, I'd like you to have that in the air soon.
Yep. And then you sent me plans for a Depron wing that I need to get knocked out. Very, very soon. And then I think I'm going to be moving on to the 7, the HRC 7, because that's been sitting over here for a little while. So that's sort of my short deck.
Okay. Okay, good. Then I guess that brings me to my workbench, huh? All right, so I'll be working on the J1000, the Junker J1000.
Okay.
I will be finishing up the Mustang this weekend. Geez, I guess that's only in a handful of days now. Oh, bye. By the time everybody's listening to this, my flying field will have a fly-in, and it'll be the Warbird fly-in. So I need to get the Mustang ready. I've already got the Spitfire, so I can at worst just bring that. But my plan is to get out there and enjoy some time at the flying field with all the guys and bring out my plane. Hopefully not make a fool of myself and crash it.
Just fly safe, fly gentle.
I know. Well, I need to build the Mustang and finish it up tomorrow so I can maybe maiden it on Friday and trim it out. I think that would be good because I don't really want to maiden it in front of a ton of guys. You know? But yeah, the FT Mustang, I'll get that going. Those are probably the big... I mean, I'm doing like 6 different things, right? Like the T6 Texan by the Hangar RC. I've got the skins on, so it's time to start actually putting the build together. I started cutting out the Wasp skins that I have, and I've already cut out the Wasp from when I projected on the wall. What I realized was the scale from projecting it on the wall is off by like 2% or 3%. And it's just enough where it's poking out. Yeah, it's poking out of this or that or whatever. And I can't just trim it and call it good. So ultimately, I'm gonna cut out a new one to put the skins on. But I think what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take what I already cut out and I'm just gonna build a Wasp and fly it and kind of just get that experience. I'm sure I'm gonna nose it in the process, and I will have another plane ready to go. I'll have the skins and I'll have that stuff. So I'll probably just get that going pretty quick. I have the Depron wing to build. I've already cut it out, so the build should go pretty quick. It looks like it looks like it'll be pretty fun. It's about 48 inch, I think, is the wingspan, and it's just a simple fold over kind of wing. But it's made of Depron, so it's gonna be a lot lighter. And I'm curious to see the differences between the two products, the Dollar Tree foam and the Depron. So I'm eager to see how that works out. I've got a maiden the Beechcraft Starship, and I've got a maiden the SR-71. Get those hopefully successfully in the air. I think there's more, I'm sure, but I think that's enough. That'll keep me busy for sure.
That's going to keep you busy.
I think. I hope.
All right.
But I want to make sure that we mention, right, we've got an event coming up. We finished a build night, was it last Friday? But we got one coming up. Joe, you want to tell us about it?
Yeah, so Saturday, April 24th, 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Eastern Daylight Time. And we'll be doing the build party again in our Discord server. So we'll have an invite in the show notes below. And we do those Saturdays not to exclude anyone. We do the Saturday ones that we started doing so that anybody who's more in the European zones or further out from there, that are just time zones different than us, are, have a chance to come, because a lot of times, we're doing it later on a Friday night. Well, that makes it, the crack of dawn on a Saturday for other folks, or it's just a time shift, so that those who are outside of our time zones who want to come or have a chance to come can come. So
exactly.
Good. Hopefully we'll see y'all on the 24th. This episode will be out in time to say that, but also we post that information on our Facebook page. So
I said pull us up to your build table.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, Matthew, if there's nothing else.
No, that's it.
All right. Well, let's work on getting out of here. Guys, as always, thank you for listening in. Truly, everybody who listens in, you're important to us, and we appreciate that you come and hang with us and enjoy the time with us every week, because we certainly enjoy sitting down and hanging out and talking. So,
absolutely.
I reckon we'll see everybody next time.
Yep. Talk to you next time.